Hi everyone, it's Luke Johnson from Noetic.online and the Noetic app. I'm also with Jennifer Avery today to do our 12th installment of Pride and Prejudice. What are we going to be talking about today, Jennifer?
Okay.
It's not going to be parallel universes, is it? Or is that's confined to the pre-show?
Yeah, that's confined to the pre-show. I don't think Jane Austen really got that deep, but she did get very deep into the human psyche and the relationships between men and women. And so the last time I think we left off at chapter 15, and oh yes, that she had just gotten to London to see Jane again, and they were about to go home. So chapter 16 of volume the second, Maria Lucas, Lizzie, and Jane all leave the gardeners in London, and they and they come to the inn where their father's carriage is going to meet them, and they find that their younger sisters Lydia and Kitty have come to meet them at this inn and have ordered them a lunch. Even though they said, oh, we're going to treat you to this lunch, and they say, by the way, though, we need to borrow money from you so we can pay for this lunch because we already spent ours. But in any case, so they meet the two younger sisters, and they find out a little bit of what's been going on around Meryton, which is close to where they live. And they find out that the militia that has been causing such a stir in the Bennet family are about to leave for Brighton. And Lydia and Kitty are both absolutely dejected. They can't believe that the militia are leaving. There's going to be nothing for them to do. Nobody look pretty poor. And so they're all just completely dejected that they're leaving. But they do offer what they think is going to be very good news to Lizzie, and that is that Wickham is no longer going to marry Mary King, which was as it stood when they left. And even though Lydia is convinced that Lizzie is going to be excited by this news, she is not at all. She says, Lydia says, now I've got some news for you. What do you think? It is excellent news, capital news, and about a certain person that we all like. And then at this point, Elizabeth looks over at the waiter and asks him to leave, because it would have been improper for ladies to talk about people of their acquaintance in front of servants and whatnot. And so they dismiss him, and then Lydia goes on, and she says, well, but now for my news. It is about dear Wickham. Too good for the waiter, is not it? There is no danger of Wickham's marrying Mary King. There's for you. She has gone down to her uncle at Liverpool, gone to stay. Wickham is safe. And Mary King is safe, added Elizabeth, safe from a connection imprudent as fortune. And so, and here's a nice little illustration of the difference between the younger girls' minds and the elder girls' minds. Lizzie says, it's not that Wickham's safe, Mary King's safe. Because if she had married Wickham, it wouldn't have been a very good match. But Lydia says, she's actually kind of stupid for leaving him because he's such a nice, good-looking guy. And so you see where Lydia and Kitty have superficial concerns. Jane and Lizzie have deeper concerns. So in any case, they find all of this out, and Lizzie just doesn't care anymore about what goes on with Wickham, because she's found out all of these horrible things. And then Lydia and Kitty go on, and all that they can ask about and all that they can talk about are men. And she tells a quick little story about how they dressed up one of the officers as a woman, and kind of pulled a prank on Wickham and another of the officers. And she tells this little story, and although it's kind of funny, again, it's more proof that, Lydia doesn't really behave herself very well, because something like that would have been seen as really in poor taste back in those days. But in any case, that's all they talk about. And then on the way, and they all cram together in the carriage, and they all go home. And when they get home, they find out. When they get home, they find out that. Oh, wait a minute. Okay, yeah. So when they get back home, Mariah Lucas is with them, and so all the Lucases are there too, and they all kind of dine together and try to catch up and everything like that. And that's pretty much how that chapter ends. And again, and Lizzie finds out that this whole subject of Brighton has been a big subject at the Longbourn house, because Lydia and Mrs. Bennet want Mr. Bennet to take them to Brighton to follow the regiment, which, after what Lizzie has learned from Mr. Darcy, that the whole town kind of sees that the Bennet girls chase after all these officers, that would be like the worst if they actually followed the regiment to Brighton. And so Lizzie is very happy to find out that they're leaving and to hear that their father doesn't want to take them to Brighton. So chapter 17, Lizzie finally gets a few minutes alone with Jane, and that's when Jane tells him, this is where Lizzie tells Jane that Mr. Darcy proposed marriage to her. And she tells her all about the letter and everything like that, and she tells her about Mr. Wickham, about what Mr. Darcy said about Wickham, and poor Jane, being Jane, is just so amazed. She just can't believe what she hears, and she wants so badly for everybody to be innocent in this whole thing that she says, oh, well, there must have been some kind of misunderstanding. Surely Mr. Wickham wouldn't act this way. But, and finally, Lizzie kind of shuts her down and says, this will not do. You never will be able to make both of them good for anything. And this is Mr. Wickham and Mr. Darcy. Take your choice, but you must be satisfied with only one. There is but such a quantity of merit between them, just enough to make one good sort of man. And of late it has been shifting about pretty much. For my part, I am inclined to believe it all Mr. Darcy's, but you shall do as you choose. And Jane is kind of satisfied by this. Okay, and they talk about it a little bit more, and finally Lizzie says, okay, well, Wickham's not a good person. Mr. Darcy is a good person. Now we figured this out, and I'm sorry, I'm getting lost.
Oh, that's okay. That's okay. Do you need a?
Let me see here. Okay. Well, they have a little bit more conversation about it, and then finally Lizzie asks Jane for her opinion on something. And the opinion that she wants from Jane is whether or not they should let the rest of the neighborhood know what they know now about Mr. Wickham. Because remember, after Mr. Darcy left, Mr. Wickham had told his sob story to everybody in the Hertfordshire neighborhood. And everybody believes what Mr. Wickham says about Mr. Darcy, because nobody there likes Mr. Darcy. And so, they kind of try to decide whether or not to kind of out Mr. Wickham as a crappy dude. And so they decide not to, because Mr. Wickham's about to leave, and Darcy's not even in the neighborhood anymore, and it's going to be too hard to convince everybody anyway, because everybody doesn't like Mr. Darcy and everybody likes Mr. Wickham, so they decide to just leave it be. Later on, Lizzie really regrets this, and so does Jane. So that's why this point is very important, that they decide not to out Mr. Wickham as a bad person. Got to remember that they decided that. And so they decide not to say anything about it, and they decide it would be too mean, kind of, to expose him right before he leaves. And so they don't say anything. And Lizzie is further a little bit pained because she decides not to tell Jane anything about the part with Mr. Bingley and about how Mr. Darcy suggested that that Mr. Bingley cut his relationship with Jane because of the inappropriateness of her family. And because Lizzie decides not to say anything because Jane is already kind of depressed. She's still kind of in low spirits. She misses Mr. Bingley, and she doesn't understand what happened, and so she's really unhappy. And the chapter ends with Lizzie's mother talking to her about Jane's situation. And, of course, her mother just continues to be her mother. She's like, oh, I can't believe that Jane never saw Bingley. Oh, well, how are the Collinses doing? I bet they talk about having our house all the time. And it's just the usual effusion of idiocy from Mrs. Bennet to close chapter 17. In chapter 18, Lizzie begins to hear more and more about this whole idea of the militia going to Brighton. It's all Lydia and Kitty are talking about. They're so sad. They can't believe they're going. They can't believe their father won't take them all to Brighton. And then Lydia gets an invitation from Colonel Forster's wife, Mrs. Forster, asking her to come with Mrs. Forster as a companion to Brighton, so she'll have a friend to kind of chat with. And this was not uncommon. A lot of times young ladies would make friends with each other, and the single would accompany the married to different places if they're traveling. And that's what's going on with Colonel Forster's wife, because she has a particular fondness for Lydia, and so she invites her along. And Lydia is absolutely in ecstasy. So it's all she can think about. It's all she talks about. And Kitty is just mad. She's crying all the time because Mrs. Forster didn't ask her. Now, Elizabeth is not at all happy to find out about this, because Lydia is one of the largest sources of impropriety in her family. This impropriety that she is now sensible to because of Mr. Darcy's letter. And she's so worried about Lydia going off with the officers and Colonel Forster's wife that she actually says something to her father about it. And she makes sure that neither her mother nor Lydia know anything about it, because she knows if they find out that Lizzie tried to talk him out of it, that they would never speak to her again. But her reasoning is extremely logical and wise. She says, well, look, Dad, if you let her go and you don't give her any instruction as to how to behave, all she's going to do is embarrass herself and embarrass the family by extension. And that's very true, because she even alludes to the fact that evils have already arisen from Lydia's behavior. And of course, Mr. Bennet is like, well, what are you talking about? Here it is right here. If you were aware, said Elizabeth, of the very great disadvantage to us all, which must arise from the public notice of Lydia's unguarded and imprudent manner, nay, which has already arisen from it, I am sure you would judge differently in the affair. Already arisen? Repeated Mr. Bennet. What? Has she frightened away some of your lovers? Poor little Lizzie, but do not be cast down. Such squeamish youths as cannot bear to be connected with a little absurdity are not worth a regret. Come, let me see the list of the pitiful fellows who have been kept aloof by Lydia's folly. Indeed, you are mistaken. I have no such injuries to resent. It is not of peculiar, but of general evils, which I am now complaining. Our importance, our respectability in the world must be affected by the wild volatility, the assurance of disdain of all restraint which mark Lydia's character. Excuse me, for I must speak plainly. If you, my dear father, will not take the trouble of checking her exuberant spirits, and of teaching her that her present pursuits are not to be the business of her life, she will soon be beyond the reach of amendment. So, essentially what Lizzie's saying, Mr. Bennet kind of tries to make light of it, like he always does. Just like, oh, she's scared away some of your boyfriends? And Lizzie's like, no. And what she's really talking about is Mr. Bingley and Jane at this point. But really, she's kind of talking about herself, because now her opinion is changing toward Mr. Darcy, although it's not all the way there yet, but she is kind of alluding to it in her own mind. But she's really talking about Mr. Bingley and Jane. And of course, he makes light of it, but Lizzie really kind of stands her ground and says, and lets her father know, look, this isn't just about me, this is about the whole family. And Mr. Bennet hears it, and he realizes that Lizzie's really concerned. And so he tries to kind of soothe her anxiety about it. But all he says is, do not make yourself uneasy, my love. Wherever you and Jane are known, you must be respected and valued, and you will not appear to less advantage for having a couple of, or I may say 3, very silly sisters. We shall have no peace at Longbourn if Lydia does not go to Brighton. Let her go then. Colonel Forster is a sensible man, and will keep her out of any real mischief. And she is luckily too poor to be an object of prey to anybody. At Brighton she will be of less importance, even as a common flirt, than she has been here. The officers will find women better worth their notice. Let us hope, therefore, that her being there may teach her her own insignificance. At any rate, she cannot grow many degrees worse without authorizing us to lock her up for the rest of her life. So Mr. Bennet kind of sees the evil, but he doesn't take it seriously, because he doesn't really understand that what Lydia does really affects the sisters more than he is acknowledging. And it's not just about her being flirty and a little bit ridiculous, but she could actually really expose the whole family to true ridicule. She could do something really stupid away from us. But Mr. Bennet says, no, let her go, and she'll be out of our hair, is basically what he says. So she'll be out of our hair. And it gets left at that. So Lizzie tried her, but even though Lizzie's not really satisfied with her father's response to this, she feels like she's done her job. And so she kind of lets it go. And again, this is extremely important later too. Lizzie makes this speech to her father. He ignores her advice, and then later on, he kind of regrets that, and he even acknowledges it. So that's important too, that she warns her father not to let Lydia go. And pretty soon, it's time for Lydia to leave with the militia, and Lizzie's family throws a party for them, and she sees Mr. Wickham here again, and but when she sees Mr. Wickham and she kind of starts to talk to him, she sees him in a completely different light now. She recognizes these, kind of pleasant, pleasing manners, but she can see the duplicity in it now. She can see that he's not really sincere. She can feel it now, and she can see it now. And so she kind of tries to ignore him all night, but he continues to try to broach the subject of everything that he told her about Mr. Darcy. But the way that conversation comes about. Okay, so they're sitting there talking to each other, and Lizzie. Okay, and so little was Elizabeth disposed to part from him in good humor that on his making some inquiry as to the manner in which her time had passed at Hunsford, she mentioned Colonel Fitzwilliam's and Mr. Darcy's having both spent 3 weeks at Rosings, and asked him if he were acquainted with the former, that is, Colonel Fitzwilliam. He looked surprised, displeased, alarmed, but with a moment's recollection and a returning smile replied that he had formerly seen him often, and after observing that he was a very gentlemanlike man, asked her how she had liked him. So Lizzie mentions Colonel Fitzwilliam to Wickham, and we know that Colonel Fitzwilliam is familiar with everything that went down between him and Mr. Darcy. And the minute she mentions Fitzwilliam, Wickham loses all composure. And now he realizes that she probably knows the truth about this, or that she may have learned it from Colonel Fitzwilliam. And so his complete aspect, his whole all of his mannerisms completely disintegrate because he knows he may be caught now. Wickham says his manners are very different from his cousin's. Yes, very different, Elizabeth says, but I think Mr. Darcy improves on acquaintance. Indeed, cried Wickham, with a look which did not escape her. And pray may I ask, but checking himself, he added, in a gayer tone, is it in address that he improves? Has he deigned to add aught of civility to his ordinary style? For I dare not hope, he continued, in a lower and more serious tone, that he has improved in essentials. And by essentials he means like his basic character. Oh no, said Elizabeth, in essentials I believe he is very much what he ever was. And so this is kind of a very subtle dig to Mr. Wickham. Lizzie says, well, Mr. Darcy improves on further acquaintance, so basically I like him better now that I know him better. And Wickham just kind of feigns this surprise and amazement and says, oh, well, I mean, is he nicer? Has he been nicer? I dare not hope that he has improved fundamentally. And Lizzie says, fundamentally, he's pretty much as he ever was, which is, again, a very subtle dig. But now, as he ever was, is like he was very kind to Wickham. And Wickham basically defecated all over it, I guess, is the best way I could. Wickham took this kindness and used it. And, he used it badly. And so now he knows that he may be caught. So she says, so basically she stands her ground and says, oh, well, yeah, I think he's a better person. I now that I know him better, I know he's a better person than I originally thought he was. And Wickham pretty much, he tries so hard to keep her on this subject and to start talking again about how bad Darcy was to him. But Lizzie's not having it. She basically avoids him for the rest of the night, and he doesn't, and he probably realizes at this point that he's been caught and he can't do this anymore with Lizzie. And so that's pretty much how they leave it. So after this party, Lydia goes with Mrs. Forster to their house in Meryton, and this is basically where the families say their goodbyes to Lydia. And Mrs. Bennet was diffuse in her good wishes for the felicity of her daughter. and impressive in her injunctions that she would not miss the opportunity of enjoying herself as much as possible, advice which there was every reason to believe would be attended to. And in the clamorous happiness, Lydia herself in bidding farewell, the more gentle adieus of her sisters were uttered without being heard. So Lydia is just so happy, she can't even hear her family saying goodbye to her, and she doesn't really care. All she hears is her mother saying, take every opportunity to enjoy yourself. And this is all she hears. And that's pretty much what she does, which we find out later. So that's pretty much how chapter 18 ends, and now on to chapter 19. And the beginning of chapter 19, Lizzie has a few. Jane Austen goes into a little bit of an observation about Lizzie's family. And this is an observation in this new light that Mr. Darcy has cast on how her family behaves. And she begins to see how improper her parents' marriage was. Mr. Bennet is this extremely intelligent man who married Mrs. Bennet because she was pretty, basically, and lively. Pretty much all there was to her. And he finds this out not long after they got married. And by that point, he realizes there's nothing more to this woman, and there's nothing I can do with it. So what he ends up doing over the years is just playing with her and kind of enjoying laughter at her expense. And although Lizzie loves her father, and she's his favorite, she begins to see that he's really kind of to blame for a lot of what's been going on in her family. So Elizabeth, however, had never been blind to the impropriety of her father's behavior as a husband. She had always seen it with pain. But respecting his abilities and grateful for his affectionate treatment of herself, she endeavored to forget what she could not overlook, and to banish from her thoughts that continual breach of conjugal obligation and decorum which, in exposing his wife to the contempt of her own children, was so highly reprehensible. But she had never felt so strongly as now the disadvantages which must attend the children of so unsuitable a marriage, nor ever been so fully aware of the evils arising from so ill-judged a direction of talents which, rightly used, this is her father's talents, might at least have preserved the respectability of his daughters, even if incapable of enlarging the mind of his wife. So Lizzie is seeing all of this with new eyes, and she begins to be able to accept that her family is not perfect. And it's something that we all do once we hit a certain age and learn enough about the world and meet enough people. We begin to see where either our families are super awesome or our families are super not. And it's one of those things that everybody has to come to when they get older, and to kind of use that information in how they raise their own family, just how this happens. But Lizzie's beginning to see all this stuff, and it's really starting to get to her. And so now she's left at home. Lydia's gone. Which is fine by her, but not a lot's been going on because there aren't as many people in the country, and so she's been kind of bored. But she discovers, but she does have something to look forward to, and that something that she has to look forward to is her trip with the Gardners to the Lake District, which is a very picturesque district of England where a lot of people, it's like going to the Smokies or something, like where people go to state parks. This is what their plan is, to tour this area. going to check it out. And Lizzie's really looking forward to this. But she gets a note not too long after, not too long before that they're actually about to leave. That the Gardners are, number one, they can't come until later on. And number two, they can't stay away as long. And they have decided, instead of going to the Lake District, they're going to go to Derbyshire. And Derbyshire, if you remember, is where Mr. Darcy is from and where his estate is. And so this is what they decide to do. And the Gardners come and stay at Longbourn for a night. And then they head out to Derbyshire with Elizabeth. And this is kind of why Lizzie really looks forward to this trip with the Gardners, is this little paragraph right here. The Gardners stayed only one night at Longbourn and set off the next morning with Elizabeth in pursuit of novelty and amusement. One enjoyment was certain, that of suitableness as companions, a suitableness which comprehended health and temper to bear inconveniences, cheerfulness to enhance every pleasure, and affection and intelligence which might supply it among themselves if there were disappointments abroad. So, in other words, Lizzie is so comfortable and happy with her aunt and uncle because they're intelligent, because they don't get all riled up if something doesn't go their way, and because even if they're not happy with what they're doing in Derbyshire, then they'll still enjoy being around each other. And so Lizzie's really looking forward to this. So they head off to Derbyshire, and she doesn't spend a lot of time about what they do there. Basically, what they just kind of tour around to different houses, and this is something that people used to do back then in England. Like, members of the gentry would visit these great houses of other members of the gentry and nobility. And all of these people would keep their houses open for visitors just to come and look at it. It's like going out. If anybody has ever been to Savannah or to Asheville, to Biltmore House, it's like going and seeing this great, beautiful manor. But back in those days, they were still inhabited by the families that owned them. But people used to do this all the time. So they go to all these different houses, and they find out, and they head to this little village called Lambton in Derbyshire. And Lizzie soon discovers that this town where Mrs. Gardner spent so much of her youth is very close to Pemberley, which is Mr. Darcy's house. And so Mrs. Gardner raises the idea of, hey, since we're so close to Pemberley, why don't we go check out Pemberley tomorrow? And Lizzie is just kind of like, oh, do I really want to go to Mr. Darcy's house after all of this has gone down between us? And if he's there and I show up there, how stupid am I going to look? And that's what Lizzie's main concern is like, what if he's there? What if I see him there? She's terrified of this idea, and so she tries to talk Mrs. Gardner out of going to Pemberley. But Mrs. Gardner talks her back down, and then she finds out from the maid at the inn that, Mr. Darcy's not there. He's not at home right now, and he shouldn't be back for a while. Lizzie's like, okay, fine, we'll go to Pemberley. And so they decide to go to Pemberley. And it's interesting to me that right here, this is the end of this chapter, I believe it's, chapter 19, is the end of the second volume. She ends volume 2 and begins volume 3 right before Lizzie goes to Pemberley. And part of the reason for this, I believe, is because the minute she sets foot on the grounds of Pemberley, Lizzie's entire attitude toward Mr. Darcy begins to change drastically. And I think that's why she decided to start a whole new volume, basically the day after the end of the second volume. And so chapter 1 of volume the third is when Lizzie and the Gardners all show up and go to Pemberley. And first thing that they see about Pemberley, that Lizzie begins to see about Pemberley, is that it is freaking huge. There's so much forest and there's so much land connected to this estate that it takes them an hour to get to the house. Like, it takes them forever to get to the house. They're going through all these woods, but even going through these woods up to the house, Lizzie is just amazed at how beautiful it is. And it's just gorgeous, this whole thing. Elizabeth was delighted. She had never seen a place for which nature had done more, or where natural beauty had been so little counteracted by an awkward taste. They were all of them warm in their admiration, and at that moment she felt that to be mistress of Pemberley might be something. Now remember, Darcy has already asked her to marry him, and she has said no. And now she's setting foot on the place that may have been hers by this point if she had said yes. And Austen spends a lot of time describing how gorgeous Pemberley is and how it takes its environment into consideration, about how everything looks natural, how everything seems to be there, to be just perfectly, naturally situated, and there's not a lot of grandiose not a lot of grandiose lawn ornamentation or boxwoods and all these super fancy gardens. It's all just nature. And the reason why she spends so much time on this is because Pemberley equals Darcy. Pemberley is Darcy. And she's describing it in this way, that Elizabeth is beginning to see Darcy, and it's reflected in her descriptions of Pemberley. Let me restate this line right here. She had never seen a place for which nature had done more, or where natural beauty had been so little counteracted by an awkward taste. So that's Darcy. Darcy is a natural person. No, he doesn't have these super polite, awesome manners that Wickham has. But he's honest. He's sincere. He is natural. He is his own dude. And so there's that. And and so while they're going through these woods, and they finally come up to the house, and what would happen was they'd basically knock on the door and ask the butler, can we speak to the housekeeper? We'd like to see the house. And they're waiting on the housekeeper. And so what the housekeeper would do is when she showed up, she would start to take the guests around to all the different rooms and show them all the paintings and tell them a little bit of the history. And so Lizzie's kind of trailing behind while they're going through all these different rooms. And again, here's a description of Pemberley that is that's analogous to Darcy. The rooms were lofty and handsome, and their furniture suitable suitable to the fortune of their proprietor. But Elizabeth saw, with admiration of his taste, that it was neither gaudy nor uselessly fine, with less splendor and more real elegance than the furniture of Rosings. And of this place, thought she, I might have been mistress. With these rooms I might now have been familiarly acquainted. Instead of viewing them as a stranger, I might have rejoiced in them as my own, and welcomed to them as visitors my uncle and aunt. So Lizzie's mind is all of a sudden like, dude, I could have lived here. I could have invited Aunt and Uncle Gardner to stay with me at this place. But that triggers the old alarm in her head. But no, recollecting herself, that could never be. My uncle and aunt would have been lost to me. I should not have been allowed to invite them. This was a lucky recollection. It saved her from something like regret. So that alarm comes back, and she's like, man, I could have lived here, and this place is just perfect, and it makes, and I love how he's got everything furnished, which means he's got good taste. Dude. Oh, but wait a minute. I couldn't have invited Aunt and Uncle Gardner because he thinks they're beneath him. And so that kind of brings her senses back. But not long after this, they're walking around the gardens, and they're going through the rooms and everything like that. And the housekeeper keeps basically just gushing over her master. She's just talking about how awesome Mr. Darcy is, how nice he is to his tenants, how good he is to his servants. He's always helping out his tenants. He's never mean to anybody. He's got such a good humor. He's so nice to his sister. He furnished this room just for her. He bought her this piano. My master is just such an awesome dude. And Lizzie's hearing all of this, and her head's spinning. And she's like, this sounds nothing like the Darcy that she knows. Although she thinks more of him than she did, she still feels like his manners aren't good. Like he's prideful and haughty and everything like that. But this housekeeper is talking about how nice he is to his tenants. And these people would have been lowly. These would have been farmers. People who lived on his land and had to give him part of, it's like a feudal thing. I mean, it's a leftover of the feudal system. They would give him part of their crops or part of the profits from their crops. And these are lowly people. But he's nice to all of them. He talks to them all. He knows them all. And she's learning all of these things that are completely contradictory to what she thinks about him. Even now, after she's gotten this letter and she's learned all these new things, she's still learning more, and it all sounds awesome. You know, this all sounds awesome to her, and she's completely, utterly amazed and confused. And they come out to the gardens, and this is after they have seen a little miniature of Mr. Wickham in one of the studies, and the housekeeper has said of Mr. Wickham that he's grown up very wild, and that he did Mr. Darcy badly. And this, of course, piques Mrs. Gardner's interest, because Mrs. Gardner believed that old story that Mr. Wickham was badly treated by Mr. Darcy. But now she's hearing this from the housekeeper, and she kind of gives Lizzie a look like, what? But all of this favorable stuff, and they go out to the gardens, and they're in, okay, I keep getting ahead of myself, I'm sorry. So they're not in the gardens yet. They go up to the portrait gallery. This is like a big, it's usually a high-ceilinged room, and it's like basically a huge hallway. And a lot of paintings would end up in these long hallways in these houses. And there's a painting of Mr. Darcy there. And the housekeeper is still talking about how awesome Mr. Darcy is, while Lizzie's looking up at this portrait. And there was certainly at this moment in Elizabeth's mind a more gentle sensation towards the original than she had ever felt in the height of their acquaintance. The commendation bestowed on him by Mrs. Reynolds was of no trifling nature. What praise is more valuable than the praise of an intelligent servant? As a brother, a landlord, a master, she considered how many people's happiness were in his guardianship, how much of pleasure or pain it was in his power to bestow, how much of good or evil must be done by him. Every idea that had been brought forward by the housekeeper was favorable to his character. And as she stood before the canvas on which he was represented, and fixed his eyes upon herself, she thought of his regard with a deeper sentiment of gratitude than it had ever raised before. She remembered its warmth and softened its impropriety of expression. So, with all of this new information, looking up at his picture, she's kind of begins like, man, he wanted to marry me. Holy crap. This is an important dude. And she's she had been seeing it in this very superficial way. And now she begins to see a depth in Darcy and all that he does and all that who everybody he's responsible for, so many people, how important he is to so many people, and this dude wanted to marry her. And now she's like, wow, holy crap. And all of this is still in her head, and they go out to the gardens, and all of a sudden, holy crap, here he is. Mr. Darcy's right there with all of this stuff still in her brain. And and she finds out that Mr. Darcy had come early because he had business. They had found out earlier that Mr. Darcy was coming to Pemberley the next day. But here he is a day early. And when they first see each other, it's not just Lizzie who is just, her mind's blown. Mr. Darcy's mind is blown too. Had his first appearance or his resemblance to the picture they had just been examining been insufficient to assure the other two that they now saw Mr. Darcy, the gardener's expression of surprise on beholding his master must immediately have told it. They stood a little aloof while he was talking to their niece, who, astonished and confused, scarcely dared lift her eyes to his face, and knew not what answer she returned to his civil inquiries after her family. Amazed at the alteration of his manner since they last parted, every sentence that he uttered was increasing her embarrassment, and every idea of the impropriety of her being there being found there recurring to her mind. The few minutes in which they continued together were some of the most uncomfortable of her life. Nor did he seem much more at ease. When he spoke, his accent had none of its usual sedateness, and he repeated his inquiries as to the time of her having left Longbourn, and of her stay in Derbyshire so often, and in so hurried a way, as plainly spoke the distraction of his thoughts. At length every idea seemed to fail him, and after standing a few moments without saying a word, he suddenly recollected himself and took leave. So Darcy is so astonished to see Lizzie that he asked the same question over a couple of times, and he's stuttering, and it's obvious that he's amazed to see her, and he's not composed, and she isn't either. And he just kind of abruptly leaves. And the gardeners are kind of like, okay, well, that's kind of crazy. And so, but they continue to take a walk around, the grounds and everything while Mr. Darcy's gone off to do whatever he's going to do. And the whole time, Lizzie's just kind of trailing behind her aunt and uncle, just like, was that Mr. Darcy? He was so nice to me. He asked me about my family. He doesn't even like my family. Why is he talking to me like this? This is so crazy, And so his entire mood, his entire presence is just completely altered to Elizabeth. And it's kind of unclear whether his manners have altered because of her perception of him, or if his manners have really altered. And that's something that one could debate. I mean, is he really being nicer to Lizzie, or can she just see more clearly that he's being nice to her? And but in any case, there's this whole change of attitude, and she's thinking about all of this while they're walking, and they're still walking, and lo and behold, here comes Mr. Darcy again. And he kind of catches up to them and purposefully goes out to meet them while they're walking. And further amazement, she's further amazed when he approaches her, and after she's kind of uttered some platitudes about how nice his property is and everything is, he says, "Oh, well, who are these people that you're with?" And she's amazed by this too, because the gardeners are the lowly people that he had said he was concerned about. These are relations that he was concerned about for Bingley. Okay, because the connections. He's not really gentry, they're kind of in trade, a lower class. But he's actually, expressing an interest in meeting this person. And so she's amazed by this. And not only does he want to be introduced to them, once he talks to them on terms of equality. He even offers to let her uncle come back and fish in his trout stream, and offers tackle and all of these different things, so he's completely, in Elizabeth's mind, Darcy has turned this complete 180, whereas she felt like he was being uppity and looking down his nose at her and all of her relatives. Now he is talking to her uncle on terms of equality. He's asking about her family. He's singling her out, and she begins to feel how, why has he changed? And she talks herself out of believing that it's because of her, because she's like, There's no reason for him to be so much nicer. Why would he be doing this? It couldn't possibly be because of me. What I said to him when he asked me to marry him, and I said no. Why would how could that have affected him so much? Because I'm a peon to him. How could this have affected him? But what she doesn't know is that it did affect him, and we find that out later. Is that what she said to him when she refused to marry him? As she said, "Had you behaved in a more gentlemanlike manner," he's correcting that error, and speaking as a woman in the modern age, and nothing against men, because women do it too, but it is a true accomplishment to get a 180 in behavior without asking for it. It's impossible.
I have to, as the United Nations representative of men, I would have to agree. We're not the most intuitive creatures.
No.
You, at least for me, you have to kind of spell it out if you want something done.
Yeah, and even as a modern human being, you can see how this change about Mr. Darcy is so significant. because he has seen the error of his ways and he is correcting them. And Lizzie is seeing it and she is amazed by it. She can barely believe it. But the pièce de résistance is before they leave Pemberley, Mr. Darcy says that he wants to introduce Lizzie to his sister. Now, somebody so highborn, who's not really intimately connected with his family, to introduce a family member just to introduce them, that's a real honor. And so Lizzie feels the importance of him asking to introduce her to his sister. And that's pretty much where the chapter leaves off. As they're leaving Pemberley, the Gardners are talking about how much they like him and how surprised they are that he had behaved in this way to Mr. Wickham, because again they had heard Mr. Wickham's version of the story. And Lizzie finally feels like she has to say something. Mrs. Gardner says, "From what we have seen of him, I really should not have thought that he could have behaved in so cruel a way by anybody as he has done by poor Wickham. He has not an ill-natured look. On the contrary, there is something pleasing about his mouth when he speaks, and there is something of dignity in his countenance that would not give one an unfavorable idea of his heart. But to be sure, the good lady who showed us the house did give him a most flaming character. I could hardly help laughing aloud sometimes, but he is a liberal master, I suppose, and that, in the eye of a servant, comprehends every virtue." Elizabeth here felt herself called on to say something in vindication of his behavior to Wickham, and therefore gave them to understand, in as guarded a manner as she could, that by what she had heard from his relations in Kent, his actions were capable of a very different construction, and that his character was by no means so faulty, nor Wickham's so amiable, as they had been considered in Hertfordshire. In confirmation of this, she related the particulars of all the pecuniary transactions in which they had been connected, without actually naming her authority, but stating it to be such as might be relied on. So Lizzie feels the need to, that whole thing about Wickham, I heard in Kent that he wasn't so awesome. But she's very discreet about, she doesn't say anything about, I heard this from Mr. Darcy himself or anything like that. She's just like, well, I heard in Kent that Mr. Wickham's kind of a creep. I was trying not to cuss. But in any case, but anyway, when they get back from Pemberley, they decide to go and see some of Mrs. Gardner's friends and Lambton, but Lizzie can't even think about it. The occurrences of the day were too full of interest to leave Elizabeth much attention for any of these new friends, and she could do nothing but think with wonder of Mr. Darcy's civility, and above all of his wishing her to be acquainted with his sister. So that's pretty much where we'll end off there. So just a quick recap. Darcy is Pemberley. Pemberley is Darcy. And when you read that chapter, you cannot separate the two, because of the way that it's described, Pemberley is described. It sounds very familiar. It sounds kind of a lot like the real Mr. Darcy. What Lizzie has discovered about him, it all falls into line with all of these new revelations about him. And then here he shows up, and he's so nice to her. And he even asks about her family. He even talks to her uncle, who she thought he would have considered so low and so inappropriate a companion, and such as that. But he's being so super nice, and he actually wants me to meet his sister now. Well, this is a big deal, and Lizzie feels it, and so that again, this is why I think that Jane Austen ended that second volume where she did, because volume 1 is kind of just like setup, and volume 2 is Mr. Darcy sucks, and volume 3 is Darcy's not so bad, he's actually kind of awesome. So there you go.
Well, thank you so much, Jennifer. That was a very entertaining lesson. I very much appreciated it. So I will have the audio edited as soon as possible, and I look forward to joining you for another session next week. Have a wonderful weekend, everybody.